My name is Solange Kittredge, and at 70, I've learned to read silence better than words. After my husband died, this old house in Selwood became my refuge, a narrow porch wrapped in ivy windows that still smelled faintly of cedar and rain. I thought I knew what loneliness sounded like. That night I learned it could knock twice, holding a child by the hand. Mireia showed up near dusk, windshield wipers still squeaking from the drizzle. Her coat was soaked, her lipstick too red for a Tuesday. "Just one night, Mom," she said, forcing a smile that slipped around the edges. "Work's been crazy." Behind her, Nayara stood small and quiet, clutching a stuffed bear with one ear half torn. She didn't wave. She didn't speak. The porch light caught in her wet lashes like tiny beads of glass. Mireia set a floral overnight bag on the bench, then checked her phone again and again. "She's already eaten," she said quickly. "She just needs a bath and bed." I reached for the bag lighter than it should have been. Inside, a single nightgown folded too neatly, a pair of socks, no toothbrush, no pajamas, no medicine. "You're sure you'll be back tomorrow?" I asked. "Of course." She brushed her hair behind her ear, the way she used to when she was lying as a teenager. Then she knelt, pressed her lips to Nayara's forehead, and whispered something I couldn't hear. The child didn't answer. I caught the faint tremor in Mireia's fingers when she stood. "You okay, honey?" Her eyes darted toward the street. "I'm fine. Don't worry." The car door shut with a hollow thud. Tail lights bled red into the mist, then vanished down the block. For a moment, all I heard was the rain tapping against the porch railing like hesitant knuckles. Inside, the house felt smaller with the two of us. I hung Mireia's forgotten umbrella by the door and turned on the lamp near the sofa. Nayara sat where her mother left her bear on her lap, shoes still on. I crouched beside her, careful not to crowd. "Let's get you warm," I said softly. "Would you like cocoa?" She nodded once, almost invisible. In the kitchen, the kettle hissed. I glanced out the window, half expecting Mireia's car to reappear. The drizzle had turned to steady rain, washing the streetlights into blurred halos. When I brought the mug to the table, Nayara hadn't moved. She stared at the front door, as if expecting someone to come back through it. I touched her shoulder gently. "She'll be home soon, sweetheart." Just one night. Her small hand gripped the bear tighter. The lamp flickered once, and for reasons I couldn't name, I went to check the locks. By the time I came back, she'd already fallen asleep on the couch. Coco untouched, bear cradled close, the rain whispering against the glass. I drew the blanket up to her chin, whispered, "Just one night, sweetheart," and turned off the light. The sound of the rain deepened steady and cold, carrying us quietly toward morning. The morning broke pale and thin, a faint light pressing through the lace curtains. The rain had passed, leaving the air heavy with the smell of wet cedar. I woke early, as I always did, padding through the quiet rooms that still held traces of yesterday's unease. Nayara was curled on the couch where she'd fallen asleep, one arm flung over her bear, the blanket tangled at her feet. For a moment, I simply watched her breathe. Children have a way of softening the edges of a room. Even her silence, though strange, carried something fragile and familiar. I moved to the kitchen, set the kettle on cracked 2 eggs into the skillet. The sizzle filled the air, ordinary and comforting. I opened the window to let in the cool air. The street outside glistened every puddle, catching the sun in small, trembling mirrors. "Morning, sweetheart," I said when she appeared at the doorway. Hair mussed, socks uneven. She didn't answer, only rubbed her eyes and climbed onto the chair. I poured her a glass of milk and slid a plate toward her. "Did you sleep all right?" She nodded once, eyes fixed on the table. I tried again. "Your mom will come by later, remember? Maybe we'll bake something for her." Still nothing. Just the soft tap of her spoon against the glass. I turned back to the stove, flipping the eggs. Behind me came a whisper so faint, I almost thought I imagined it. "Grandma!" I glanced over my shoulder. "Yes, love." She didn't meet my eyes. Her small fingers tightened around the bear's arm. "Mommy told me not to tell you what I saw at home." The spoon slipped from my hand, clattering against the counter. The eggs hissed and burned at the edges, the smell turning sharp and bitter. I forced my voice steady. "What did you see?" Darling Nayara froze. Her lip trembled, eyes wide and glossy, but she shook her head. "I can't." I crouched beside her chair, careful not to startle. "It's all right. You can tell Grandma anything, I promise." Her shoulders hunched. She looked down at the bear, whispering something into its ear. I couldn't hear the words. Then she began to hum softly, a tuneless sound that didn't belong in any morning. I placed a hand over hers, felt the tiny pulse under her skin racing. "You don't have to talk now," I said gently. "We can just sit." Her hand stayed rigid beneath mine, then loosened the humming, fading to silence. I turned off the stove, opened a window wider. The breeze carried the scent of toast and rainwater. I tried to steady my breath. Whatever she meant, it wasn't a child's game. That much I knew. We ate in silence, or rather I pretended to. Nayara picked at her bread gaze far away. When she finished, she slipped off the chair, went to the living room, and began lining up her bear and a few dolls in a perfect row facing the window. I watched from the doorway. She was arranging them as if they were waiting for something or someone. The phone buzzed on the counter, a text from Mireya. "Running late. Might not make it tonight. Love you." I stared at the words until they blurred. In the living room, Nayara spoke softly to her toys, repeating the same sentence again and again. I could barely make it out, something about lights and doors. I walked over, knelt behind her, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You're safe here," I murmured. She leaned back against me without speaking. Her small body was trembling. I wrapped my arms around her and felt the weight of her silence settle in my chest, like a warning. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. It was only beginning. That afternoon, the rain returned in slow, unhurried drips. Nayara had fallen asleep on the couch again, her bear pressed to her chest, the blanket sliding toward the floor. I sat nearby with a book I wasn't reading, letting the ticking clock fill the silence. It was the same rhythm that used to mark nap times long ago, back when this house held more voices, more laughter. Sometimes memories arrive like visitors you didn't invite but can't turn away. Mine always started with Ethan's laugh. My son's laughter had a warmth that could fill any room. He was a builder. Hands rough, voice soft. When he married Mireya, I thought he'd found his match. She was lively back then, a woman who could talk a mile a minute, teasing him out of his seriousness. They lived 2 streets over a small rental house with yellow shutters, and the kind of backyard where everything grew wild. I used to spend weekends there helping Mireya with dinner, while Ethan grilled outside music, playing from an old radio. Nayara was barely walking, then her curls bouncing as she followed her father from room to room. He'd scoop her up and spin her until she squealed. And then one evening, the phone rang. I remember the sound of the rain that night, too. There had been an accident at the site near the river. A scaffolding collapse, they said. A name among 3 others. Ethan Kittredge, age 34. The days that followed are a blur. I rarely let myself revisit the funeral. The casseroles left on my porch, the way Mireya sat motionless beside the casket, as if listening for footsteps that would never return. Afterward, she changed. It wasn't immediate, but grief never announces itself politely. First came the job changes, office assistant, then waitress, then a stint at some real estate agency that never seemed to pay on time. Then new friends' faces, I didn't recognize voices that laughed too loudly when they visited. I tried asking, but Mireya would wave me off. "I'm fine, Mom. I'm figuring things out." I'd catch glimpses of her at the grocery store sometimes, dressed in expensive shoes she couldn't afford. Her hair dyed darker each month, eyes shadowed as if she hadn't slept. I'd want to ask about Nayara, about the bills, about anything. but she'd hug me fast and promise to call. She rarely did. Now, as I watched her daughter sleep, I felt that same ache pressing behind my ribs, the one that started the day Ethan died. I brushed a strand of hair from Nayara's forehead, whispering his name under my breath like a prayer. The phone on the counter buzzed. I checked it, expecting maybe a text. Instead, a new voicemail. Maria's voice came through breathless and rushed. "Thanks again, Mom. Don't ask questions. Okay, I'll come by soon." The line clicked dead. I stood there for a long time, the static hum still in my ear, the drizzle outside turning harder against the glass. Upstairs, Nayara shifted in her sleep, murmuring something I couldn't quite hear. I told myself it was nothing, that grief twists people into strangers. But a part of me, the part that still listened to silence, knew this wasn't just grief. It was something else entirely. The next morning, the air had turned crisp, carrying that faint scent of pine from the wet park down the street. Nayara sat at the kitchen table with a handful of crayons while I folded laundry nearby. The quiet between us had settled into something delicate, neither tense nor peaceful, just careful. She had always liked to draw. Ethan used to say she inherited my patience for details. But the shapes forming beneath her small hand that morning made my chest tighten. She drew a square that filled nearly the whole page, then shaded the bottom half darker than the rest. Inside it, tiny stick figures stood in a row. Their arms were lines pressed against vertical bars. Above them, she scribbled something that looked like a circle with jagged edges. "That's a lot of doors, sweetheart," I said gently. "Is this a school?" She shook her head without looking up. "It's our house. Our house. The one with the light that hums." I blinked. "What light, honey?" She lifted the crayon and pointed to the circle she'd drawn, the jagged one. "The basement light. It hums all the time." The word basement landed heavier than it should have. Maria's place was an older rental. I remembered the cracked foundation and mildew when I'd helped her move in years ago. I hadn't been in that basement since. Before I could ask more, Nayara crumpled the drawing, stuffed it into her lap, and changed the subject. "Can we bake cookies later?" I forced a smile. "Of course we can." All day, little details kept catching my attention like burrs on fabric. Nayara startled whenever a car passed outside, her shoulders jerking, even when it was only the mail truck. At dusk, a beam of headlights swept through the window, and she dropped her spoon milk, spilling across the table. "It's just a car, sweetheart," I said softly, dabbing the spill with a towel. Her eyes stayed wide on the window. "It looks like the one that comes at night," she whispered. "What car?" But she only pressed her lips together and clutched her bear. That night, after she fell asleep, I sat on the couch with my reading glasses and a small notebook. I hadn't written anything down in years, not since Ethan's death. But now I needed order proof, something that made sense of the unease creeping into every corner of my thoughts. Page 1, Saturday, 8:42 p.m. Nayara mentioned a basement light that hums. Page 2, flinched at headlights. Drew picture of locked doors. Each note steadied me for a moment, like rails on a narrow path. Still, by the time I reached the end of the third page, my handwriting had started to shake. When I checked on Nayara before bed, she was curled up facing the wall, the crumpled drawing half hidden under her pillow. I eased it out gently. The page had smudged where her fingers pressed too hard, but I could still see the outline of the stick figures. There were 6 of them this time, 5 inside the dark box, and 1 outside smaller, holding something that looked like a key. The hum of the refrigerator filled the kitchen when I turned off the light. I stood there for a long while, listening to the quiet pulse of the house, trying to convince myself that what she'd drawn was just a child's imagination. But as I folded the note into my pocket, I realized the silence around me didn't feel like safety anymore. It felt like the moment before something breaks. I placed the notebook beside the phone, checked the locks again, and left the light over the sink, burning through the night. Nayara murmured once in her sleep, the words too soft to understand. By morning, I had written one last line before closing the notebook. Something is happening in that house. I need to know what. By Monday morning, the rain had turned thin and relentless, stitching gray lines across the kitchen window. Nayara sat in the living room, with her crayons humming softly, while I stood by the phone, the receiver, heavy, in my hand. I had reread my notes from the night before twice. The words stared back at me, plain and certain, locked doors, humming light night car. I didn't want to believe it was serious, but believing nothing was worse. The number for the Portland Police Department was printed on an old flyer pinned by a magnet shaped like a tomato. I dialed, listening to the dull clicks between rings. Portland Police Non-Emergency Line. How can I help you? The voice on the other end was brisk, the kind that handled 100 calls a day. I gave my name, then explained that my granddaughter had said odd things about her home. That I didn't know if they meant anything, but I was worried. Is the child in immediate danger, ma'am? I hesitated. I don't know. She mentioned a basement, a light that hums. She draws strange things. A pause, the faint tapping of keys. We can make a note of concern, the woman said finally. But unless you have evidence of neglect or abuse, it would be better to contact Child Protective Services. Could you send someone to check? Just to be sure. Another pause. I imagined her glancing at a clock, already moving to the next name on her list. Without probable cause, we can't dispatch an officer. I'll log the report under a case number for reference. The sound of typing filled the silence. I gripped the counter edge. May I have the number? Of course. Case 24139C. You should call CPS directly. They'll know how to proceed. Her tone wasn't unkind, but it was distant, careful, the kind of voice that lives behind a desk. I thanked her anyway and wrote the numbers in my notebook, pressing the pen too hard. After I hung up, the house felt even quieter. The refrigerator hummed steady and indifferent. In the living room, Nayara was drawing again this time. Something brighter, flowers maybe, though one corner of the page stayed dark. I picked up a small yellow sticky note and copied the case number again, each stroke deliberate. Then I walked to the refrigerator and stuck it beside the calendar. It looked absurd there, among grocery lists and reminders for dentist appointments, a strip of official ink in a home that smelled of toast and soap. I stood for a long moment, staring at it. One note on one fridge in one house, a voice in a sea of other small alarms that might never be heard. Later, I made myself a cup of tea and carried it to the porch. The drizzle had softened to mist, coating the railing in beads of silver. Across the street, the neighbor's wind chime trembled faintly, the sound thin and sweet. Inside, Nayara began to sing under her breath, a soft tune with no words. Her voice drifted through the open door, high and uncertain, like something searching for the right key. I sat down and opened my notebook again, writing one last entry before closing it. Called police. Referred to child services. Case filed, waiting. The page fluttered under the draft from the door. The rain picked up again, whispering against the roof, in patient rhythm, as if time itself had decided to wait with me. By Tuesday afternoon, the clouds had thinned enough for a pale stripe of light to fall across the yard. I decided to take Nayara to school myself. Maria still hadn't called, and every text I sent came back with a single word: busy. At the kindergarten gate, the world felt both ordinary and foreign parents, chatting, the smell of crayons and disinfectant drifting from open windows. Nayara clung to my sleeve until she spotted her teacher, a slim woman with chestnut hair pulled into a low bun. Mrs. Kittredge, she asked softly when I approached. I'm Paloma Soria, Nayara's teacher. Her voice carried the warmth of someone used to calming small storms. She crouched beside Nayara and smiled. You're back, little one. We missed you yesterday. Nayara nodded, but didn't let go of me. Her hand stayed tight around my wrist, her eyes darting toward the hallway lights that flickered overhead. After class began, Ms. Soria asked if I had a moment to talk. She led me into a small office lined with construction paper suns and finger-painted trees. The air smelled faintly of glue and lemon cleaner. She closed the door gently. I've been meaning to reach out. Nayara's a bright child, very observant, but there are things I've noticed. She opened a slim blue folder on the desk. Inside were pages of notes and small drawings. She's been covering her ears when we turn off the lights for nap time, she said quietly. She says the dark makes the walls hum. My throat tightened. The walls hum. Ms. Soraya nodded. She also drew this last week. She handed me a paper. It was another square filled with dark scribbles, thick, frantic strokes. In the corner, a small stick figure crouched beneath a hanging bulb. She told me the light in their basement makes that sound, the teacher added. I tried asking gently, but she shut down. You can tell she's scared of saying the wrong thing. I set the drawing down carefully, afraid to tear it. I've heard her mention that too. I called the police yesterday. They said to contact child services. Ms. Soria's expression softened. You did the right thing. I'm a mandated reporter, which means I have to file my own report when something like this comes up. It doesn't mean anyone's in trouble. It's just to make sure she's safe. I nodded, though my heart had started to thud in my chest. Will they talk to her? Yes. A caseworker will be assigned probably today or tomorrow. They'll handle it gently. She filled out a short form while I sat there, my fingers tracing the edge of Nayara's drawing. At the bottom, she signed her name in neat script, Paloma Soria. The blue ink bled slightly through the paper. When she handed me a copy, she met my eyes. You're not alone in this, Mrs. Kittredge. Whatever's happening, we'll make sure she's heard. The reassurance should have comforted me. Instead, it felt like standing at the edge of something I couldn't see clearly, yet something too large to name. As I left, I passed Nayara's classroom. She sat cross-legged on the rug, sorting colored blocks, lips moving silently. Her teacher's aide touched her shoulder, and she flinched before forcing a smile. Outside, the air smelled of rain again, though the sky was still bright. I walked home slowly, clutching the folder to my chest, as if it were something fragile. On the kitchen table, I placed it beside my notebook. The two piles, my shaky notes, and the teacher's crisp documentation looked like pieces of the same unfinished puzzle. For the first time, I felt both relief and fear at once. Relief that someone else had seen what I'd seen. Fear, because now it was written down, stamped, and real. That evening, I called the number at the bottom of the form and left a message for the assigned caseworker. Her name was Leah Benet. I didn't know her yet. But as I hung up, the sense of waiting began again. Only now the waiting had a name and a file somewhere in the city, with my granddaughter's written across the top. By Thursday, word had already spread farther than I could have imagined. I felt it the moment I stepped into the little grocery on Burnside Avenue, the way conversations thinned, then resumed, just as I passed softer, cautious. It wasn't shouting or cruelty. It was worse, the careful sympathy people save for those they think are losing their grip. Poor Mrs. Kittredge, I heard one of the clerks whisper behind the bread aisle. Such a sweet lady, but she's, old age does things. I kept my head high, forcing my cart forward, pretending to read labels. The smell of coffee grounds and oranges wrapped around me like a reminder of simpler errands of mornings when I'd come here with Ethan as a boy, tugging at my sleeve. Now every step felt like walking through glass. At the counter, the cashier, young, polite, uncomfortable, avoided my eyes. Good morning, Mrs. Kittredge, he said, scanning my items too quickly. How's your granddaughter? She's fine, I answered. though the word felt like a fragile promise I couldn't keep. Outside, the sky was a pale gray stretch over the neighborhood. I tucked the grocery bag under my arm and started home, hearing the echo of those whispers all the way down the street. Senile. It wasn't new, that word. It followed women like me alone, too. Watchful, too sure of things no one else wanted to see. At the corner, a voice called out low and steady, "Solange!" It was Teo Morales, my neighbor across the street. He was in his early 70s, with a slight limp and a gardener's patience in his movements. His wife had passed 2 years ago, but he still trimmed the hedge between our houses every Saturday, as if she might return to admire it. "You've been keeping quiet lately," he said, resting one hand on his cane. "Everything all right?" I hesitated, studying his face. He wasn't like the others. His eyes didn't hold that polite pity. "People think I'm imagining things I said finally, but my granddaughter's been saying strange things about her mother's house. I made some calls. They're investigating." Teo's expression darkened slightly. "I've heard talk about you, yes," he said, "but I wouldn't pay it much mind." He looked down the street toward Mireya's neighborhood, the way the asphalt dipped and turned near the row of sycamores. "Sometimes people talk because it's easier than listening." He paused, the wind tugging at the hem of his jacket. "Thing is," he added quietly, "I've heard things too, at night, from that side of the street." I frowned. "What kind of things?" He shifted his weight as if choosing each word carefully. "Not often. Maybe once or twice a week. A car pulling up late. A door slamming, then crying. The kind that stops too suddenly. The sound of it, those 2 words too suddenly pressed against my chest." I wanted to ask more, but Teo only shook his head. "Could be nothing," he said, though his tone said otherwise. "But I'll keep my ears open. You're not crazy, Solange. Don't let them make you think you are." When I reached my house again, the groceries felt heavier than before. I placed them on the counter, each item dull and distant against the bright kitchen light. Through the window, Teo was still out front, trimming his hedge in slow, careful strokes. I stood there watching him until the hum of his clippers faded into the rhythm of the street. The loneliness didn't lift, but for the first time that week, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the beginning of someone finally listening. The knock came just after 9, soft but deliberate. I was still rinsing breakfast dishes when Nayara froze at the sound, her spoon clattering into the sink. I wiped my hands on a towel and opened the door to a woman in a tan coat holding a folder against her chest. "Mrs. Kittredge," she asked. "I'm Leah Benet with Child Protective Services." Her voice was calm, steady, with that practiced gentleness people use when they expect resistance. She couldn't have been older than 35. Dark curls pinned neatly, eyes sharp, but kind. I nodded and stepped aside. The living room looked too tidy, as if I'd staged my life for inspection. Nayara sat on the couch, clutching her bear. Leah smiled as she knelt to the child's level. "Hi, Nayara. I'm Leah. I just want to talk to you for a few minutes, okay? You can tell me anything you want." Nayara gave the smallest nod, eyes on the bear's ear. Leah spoke softly, asking about school, favorite games, what she liked to do at home. Nayara's answers were clipped polite, the kind she'd learned kept adults from asking more. When the questions turned toward her mother's house, she began to twist the bear's arm until the stuffing shifted under the fur. "Your mom's house sounds nice," Leah said gently. "Do you have a room there?" Nayara's lips pressed together. Her eyes darted toward me, then to the window. "It's dark sometimes," she murmured. Leah paused, pen hovering. "Dark." Nayara shrugged and turned away. "Can I draw now?" I brought her crayons. She bent over the paper and began sketching with furious focus a row of uneven rectangles, each topped by a light bulb. Leah watched silently. After a few minutes, she asked if we could speak privately. I led her to the kitchen, the ticking clock suddenly too loud. She's withdrawn, Leah said softly. That's clear. But she hasn't given any direct statement about harm or danger. She's scared, I said. You can see that. I can, she admitted. But for legal intervention, I need more than fear. I'll file today's visit in the system. It means we'll keep an eye on things check-ins reports from her teacher, but no removal or protective action right now. The words settled like ash between us. She'll be going back to her mother's tonight, Leah asked. Yes. Maria's supposed to pick her up after work. Leah closed her folder carefully. Keep documenting anything unusual. And if you ever believe Nayara's in immediate danger, call the emergency line, not CPS. Her eyes lingered on me for a moment, a look of apology and restraint, all tangled together. You're doing what you can, Mrs. Kittredge. I wish it were enough. By the time she left, the afternoon light had begun to fade. I stood at the window watching her car pull away, feeling the house shrink around me. An hour later, Maria arrived. She didn't come in. She stayed on the porch, phone in hand, eyes hidden behind sunglasses, though the sky was overcast. Thanks for keeping her, she said. I heard CPS stopped by. You shouldn't have called them Mom. Her tone wasn't angry, just cold, stripped of anything human. I did what I thought was right, I replied. Maria gave a dry laugh, brushing hair from her face. You never know when to stop meddling. She held out her hand to Nayara, who hesitated before following her down the steps. The little girl looked back once, just once, before the car door closed and the engine started. When they drove away, the quiet that settled over the porch didn't feel like peace. It felt like the calm before something breaks loose. It was near dusk when Teo knocked on my door. The wind had turned sharp, carrying the smell of rain and the faint buzz of street lamps struggling to flicker on. I'd just poured myself tea, the kind of late afternoon ritual that steadied my hands when his shadow filled the doorway. Solange, he said, his voice low, urgent, in a way that made my heart quicken. I think you'd better come see something. He led me across the street to his porch. His small bungalow was dim, except for the blue glow of his television, and a lamp turned low beside a worn leather chair. On the coffee table sat his old laptop, its charging cable twisted around like a vein. Teo motioned for me to sit. My nephew helped me set up these security cameras after the break-ins last year, he said. They pick up movement at night, mostly raccoons and delivery vans, but yesterday, I went through the feed from last weekend. He double-clicked a file. The grainy footage blinked to life. The timestamp read 2:13 a.m., Friday. The street looked empty, rain streaking across the lens. Then movement. A car eased to a stop in front of Maria's house. Headlights off. The driver's door opened, and my daughter stepped out. Her coat was drawn tight, her head darting side to side. For a moment, she stood still, as if listening. Then she walked around to the passenger side and opened the door. A small figure climbed out. Even through the distortion of the rain, I could see the outline a child, much smaller than Nayara. The girl's shoulders hunched beneath a thin jacket, hair cropped short, her steps hesitant. Maria took her by the hand and led her up the walkway. The front door opened, light spilling out, then vanished as the door shut behind them. The clip ended there. Teo froze, the frame zoomed in slightly, though the picture only grew blurrier. Still, I could make out enough the slope of my daughter's shoulders, the tilt of her head, the shape of that small, trembling silhouette beside her. My voice came out dry. That's not Nayara. No, Teo said quietly. It isn't. The clock on his wall ticked steady and cruel. I tried to breathe, but my chest refused to move. How long ago? 5 nights, he replied. I almost erased it, thought maybe it was a relative or a friend's kid, but after what you told me, he let the sentence hang there, unfinished. For a long time we sat in silence. The hum of his refrigerator filled the space, and in the background, the muted sound of rain hitting the roof. When I finally stood, my knees trembled. Can you make me a copy? He nodded. Already did. On this. He handed me a small USB stick labeled in his careful handwriting. Footage 2:13 a.m. Back home, I couldn't sit still. I laid the drive on the counter as if it were something fragile, afraid to touch it, afraid not to. Then I called the Portland Police Department again and asked for Lieutenant Arrieta. He answered, after 2 transfers, his voice clipped, but polite. Yes, Mrs. Kittredge, I remember you. I have something I said. Security footage. My daughter, she's bringing a child into her home late at night. Not Nyara, another girl. A pause. Do you have the footage with you? Yes, it's on a drive. You can see her face and the timestamp. Please, Lieutenant, I need you to look. He exhaled slowly. All right. Come by tomorrow morning. Bring the file and I'll review it personally. When the call ended, I stood there gripping the phone, the sound of my own pulse roaring in my ears. The room around me felt smaller, as though the air had thickened with everything I didn't want to believe. I slid the USB into my pocket and turned off the kitchen light. Across the street, Mireya's house sat in silence, its windows dark. Somewhere inside, perhaps, beneath that same roof where my son once lived, a different child was breathing the same air, unseen. And for the first time since this began, my doubt turned to something harder conviction. The next morning, Portland felt washed clean but heavy, the streets slick with last night's rain. I arrived at the precinct carrying the small USB drive like it was glass. The front desk officer led me through to Lieutenant Arrieta's office, where the faint hum of computers filled the air. He looked older than I remembered gray stubble, weary eyes, but his posture was sharp. Mrs. Kittredge, he said, gesturing toward a chair. Let's take a look at what you brought. I handed him the drive without a word. He plugged it into his monitor, clicking through folders with the precision of someone who didn't like to waste time. The grainy footage filled the screen, and I felt my stomach tighten all over again. The timestamp blinked at the corner, 02:13:27. Mireya's car. The slow movement, the door opening, the child stepping out. Arrieta leaned closer. He replayed the segment twice, adjusting the contrast until the figures became slightly clearer. That's your daughter. Yes, I whispered. And the girl. She's not my granddaughter. He didn't reply at first. His hand moved toward the keyboard, pulling up another screen, some kind of database. I could see lines of names, dates, and photographs scrolling past faster than I could read. Hold on, he murmured, narrowing his eyes. There's an active Amber Alert out of Salem. He enlarged a photo. A small girl with cropped hair, round cheeks, and eyes too serious for her age. Beneath it, the text read, Lucerito Ramos, age 5. Missing since February 8th. He clicked back to the footage, froze the frame, then looked at me. I'll need to have this verified by forensics, but the resemblance is strong. Very strong. My pulse began to thrum in my throat. So she's real, I said softly. That child exists. Arrieta nodded, jaw tightening. It looks that way. He stood walking to a secondary desk covered in reports and wires. Picking up the phone, he spoke in the clipped tone of command. Calm, practiced urgency. Requesting an emergency e-warrant for entry and search. Location 4827 Woodmere. Possible link to Salem missing person case. Forwarding video evidence. He glanced at me between phrases, his eyes both firm and cautious. Yes, coordinate with CPS, he continued. Caseworker Bennett already logged a welfare check at that address last week. The mention of Leah's name made me catch my breath, so it wasn't just me anymore. When he hung up, he looked back at me. This will take a few hours to process. Once the warrant's cleared, we move. If what's in that house confirms the match... He stopped himself. You did the right thing, Mrs. Kittredge. The words should have felt like vindication, but they landed somewhere heavier. I stared at the still frame on the monitor. my daughter's hand gripping that small wrist, her face half hidden by the porch light. I wanted to remember her as she was before Ethan's death. The young woman who laughed in my kitchen, who sang along to the radio while baking pies, who loved her husband with all she had. Now that image was gone, replaced by a woman leading someone else's child into the dark. I pressed my palms together to stop them from shaking. "Lieutenant, when you find that girl," my voice cracked. Will they take Nyara away too?" His eyes softened, if only slightly. "That depends on what we find. But right now, the priority is the missing child. The rest, we'll handle carefully. Carefully." The word felt like a fragile promise. When I stepped outside, the morning had brightened sunlight spilling through breaks in the clouds. I sat on the precinct steps for a long while, my hands cold against the rail. Across the street, traffic rolled by, ordinary as ever, the world unbothered by what might be happening inside one small house miles away. For the first time in weeks, my fear shifted no longer aimless, but sharpened into something like purpose. Somewhere in Salem, a mother might be waiting for a call the same way I had once waited for one that never came. And maybe finally one would come that brought her child home. When I looked down at my hands again, I realized they'd stopped trembling. By dawn, the sky had turned the color of damp paper, the kind of gray Portland wore like a second skin. The patrol cars arrived first, their headlights slicing through the thin drizzle. I followed in the back of a CPS vehicle, hands clasped tight on my lap, while the wipers scraped back and forth, back and forth. Leah Benet sat beside me, her folder resting against her knees. She didn't say much, only met my eyes once as we turned onto Maria's street. "We'll handle this carefully," she murmured. When we stopped in front of the house, everything inside me wanted to run. The home my son once owned before the accident now looked smaller, the porch sagging slightly, its windows blank, as if holding their breath. Lieutenant Arrieta stood near the gate, his coat dark with rain. "We'll proceed calmly," he said, his tone clipped but steady. "Mrs. Kittredge, please stay behind us." I nodded, though the cold air made my knees shake. The knock on the door was firm, official. For a moment, nothing. Then footsteps inside, quick, uneven, and Maria appeared, her face pale under the porch light. "What is this?" she demanded. "Why are you here?" Ma'am Arrieta said, holding out the document. "We have a lawful search warrant connected to an ongoing investigation. Please step aside." Her eyes darted from the paper to me, standing behind the officers. "You called them again," she hissed. "You just can't stop." I opened my mouth, but no words came. "I haven't done anything wrong," she went on, voice shaking. "You're wasting your time." Behind her, a man's voice rose from deeper in the house. "What the hell is this about?" It was Ricardo, her late husband's brother, the one who'd moved in after Ethan's funeral, the one whose presence had always unsettled me. He stormed into the doorway, hair unkempt, jaw tight. "You people can't just barge in here," Sir Arrieta said evenly. "Stand back." Ricardo glared, stepping closer. "This is harassment. She's grieving, and you're feeding her mother's delusions." Leah interjected, calm but firm. "We're here to ensure the safety of minors. Cooperation will make this easier for everyone." The tension was thick enough to taste. Maria crossed her arms, shoulders trembling. "There's nothing to find. You'll see that." Two officers entered first, scanning the living room, the kitchen, each corner ordinary and clean, too clean. A faint smell of bleach hung in the air. Then came the hallway. I knew that hallway. The narrow floorboards Ethan once polished himself. The family photos that used to hang along the wall were gone now, replaced by bare plaster. At the far end stood a small metal door I hadn't seen in years, the basement entrance, its frame warped slightly from moisture. An officer tried the knob. Locked. "Basement lieutenant," he called out. Mireia moved fast, stepping between them. There's nothing down there, just tools and boxes. It's moldy. Dangerous. Her voice cracked on the last word. Arrieta's tone hardened. Keys, please. I said it's dangerous. Ricardo moved closer, but another officer blocked him, his hands balled into fists. You can't. We can. Arrieta cut in, pulling out a master key ring. Step back, ma'am. Mireia's composure splintered. She reached for the knob, pressing her back to the door like she could hold it shut with her body. Don't do this, she whispered. You don't understand. Arrieta's expression didn't change. Move aside. When she didn't, one of the officers gently took her arm and guided her back. She started crying, not loud, not dramatic, but the small, breaking sound of someone whose secrets had just run out of space. The officer slid the key into the lock. For a heartbeat, everything went still. The rain outside, the murmur of radios. Even my breathing. The latch clicked sharp and final. Mireia turned her face away, tears streaking down her cheeks. Please, she said hoarsely, just leave it closed. But Arrieta nodded to his team. The door creaked open and a wave of damp air rushed out, cold, thick, and stale, carrying with it the faint hum of an electric light somewhere below. I caught a glimpse of narrow stairs vanishing into shadow. No one spoke. The silence felt alive, like the house itself was holding its breath. Then Arrieta drew his flashlight and stepped inside first. I stood frozen at the threshold. My daughter's muffled sobs behind me, the sound of the rain mingling with something else, faint, uncertain, rising from the dark below. And for the first time, I understood. Whatever lived behind that door had been waiting to be found. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Damp concrete rust and something sour, like old milk, and fear. Arrieta's flashlight cut a thin, trembling beam down the narrow stairs, illuminating dust, floating in the air like ash. Every step creaked under the officer's boots. I stood at the top, clutching the doorframe, afraid to move, but unable to look away. Mireia was sobbing behind me, her voice breaking into fragments. You don't understand. I was protecting her, she cried, her hands shaking, her wrists already being held by an officer. You don't know what they were going to do to her. No one answered. The only sound came from below, a faint, rhythmic whimper. Lieutenant! One of the officers called from the darkness. There's someone here. Time collapsed into noise boots, scraping the metallic ring of a chain, dropping a sudden rustle of fabric. Then Arrieta's voice, low but steady. We need a medic. Now. I descended before I realized I was moving. The air thickened with every step. My hand brushed the wall. It was damp and cold. The light swung ahead, revealing a small concrete space no bigger than my pantry. In one corner, beneath the flicker of a single hanging bulb, a child sat curled in a threadbare blanket. Her skin was pale, her face smeared with dirt, her knees drawn to her chest. A pair of dark eyes stared back at the sudden burst of light, blinking against it, wide and terrified. Lucerito Ramos Arrieta said softly, crouching beside her. It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe now. She didn't speak, only trembled. Her lips parted as if to cry, but no sound came. One of the paramedics, young calm, moving like he'd done this too many times, stepped forward, draping a fresh blanket around her. She's dehydrated, he murmured. Malnourished. But she's alive. Alive. The word echoed in my head, slow and heavy, as if it didn't quite belong to this place. Behind us, footsteps pounded down the stairs. It was Nayara, her small voice breaking through the chaos. Grandma Leah Benet caught her halfway, but she slipped free, rushing into my arms. I knelt and pulled her close, feeling her heartbeat against mine, fast and terrified. She buried her face in my shoulder, whispering mommies, yelling. Above us, Mireia's voice rang through the open door, high, cracked, desperate. She needed me. They were going to take her back to that man. Arrieta climbed the stairs, his tone calm but final. "Ma'am, you need to stop talking. You have the right to remain silent." The sound of handcuffs snapped through the air. Maria screamed once hoarse, almost feral, then broke into quiet sobs. I held Nayara tighter, rocking slightly without realizing it. The paramedics carried Lucarito up the stairs on a stretcher, her small hand clutching the blanket. For a moment, her eyes met mine. There was no recognition, no gratitude, just exhaustion and the hollow, stunned look of a child who had lived too long in the dark. When we reached the yard, the morning had shifted into a cold, colorless light. Rain drizzled again, thin as breath. The neighbors had gathered behind the police tape, whispering the kind of whispers that change everything once they leave a street like this. Leah stayed beside me, one hand steady on my shoulder. "She'll be taken to the children's hospital first," she said quietly. "Her family's been contacted. They'll come soon." I nodded, but couldn't speak. My daughter was being led into the back of a police car, her hair plastered to her face, eyes wild with something between guilt and conviction. She looked at me as the door closed, one long, desperate look that belonged to neither the woman she was nor the girl I raised. The engine started. The blue lights pulsed against the rain. Nayara whispered into my coat voice, trembling, "Grandma, what's happening?" I brushed her hair back and said the only truth I could manage. "Something that needed to end, sweetheart." The ambulance pulled away, its siren cutting through the stillness. I watched it until the sound faded into nothing, until the drizzle blurred everything. Houses, cars, faces into gray. Then I realized my hands were still shaking, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing that saving one child had cost me another. By the time the last patrol car left the street, had turned eerily still. The rain had stopped, but the air carried that damp heaviness that follows a storm, a silence too complete to trust. I sat on the porch steps, Nayara asleep in my lap, her small hand curled against my wrist. The blue light from the departing ambulances still flickered faintly against the wet pavement, painting everything in a strange half-glow. Lieutenant Arrieta approached quietly, his coat unbuttoned, the lines of fatigue deep around his mouth. "Mrs. Kittredge," he said, voice gentle, "we'll need your full statement tomorrow morning, just procedure." I nodded. "Will she—" "My daughter. She's being processed tonight," he said carefully. "The district attorney's office will handle the rest. There's a lot we don't know yet, why she did it, how long the girl was there. But the child's safe now. Safe." The word felt heavy, like something too large to hold. Arrieta looked at me for a long moment before adding, "You did the right thing, even if it doesn't feel that way right now." Then he turned, spoke briefly to Leah Benet by the patrol car, and drove off, leaving the street in a hush that buzzed faintly with the murmurs of neighbors gathered at the edge of the block. They didn't come close. They stood in small clusters, hands folded, voices low. Some looked curious, others sympathetic, and a few couldn't hide the flicker of judgment. I recognized faces I'd known for years, people who once brought over casseroles after Ethan's funeral, who'd shared sugar or mail or garden cuttings. Now they stared as if I'd pulled the veil off something no one wanted to see. Teo crossed the street first. His limp was more pronounced tonight, but his expression steady. "They're saying things, Solange," he murmured, "but you don't have to listen." "I'm too tired to," I said, my voice catching. He nodded, resting one hand on my shoulder. Behind him, Rosa, my old friend from church, appeared, holding a thermos of chamomile tea. She didn't say anything, just pressed it into my hands. A small kindness, warm and grounding. Then Ms. Soria arrived, still in her work cardigan, hair damp from the drizzle. "I heard," she said softly. "I stayed with the children until the last parents came. They saw the news trucks. I couldn't meet her eyes. She was your student, I murmured. And my daughter did that to her. She was everyone's responsibility, Paloma said. You acted when no one else would. Her words settled somewhere deep, neither comfort nor accusation, just truth. From across the street, the press van's headlights flickered on. I could already imagine the stories that would follow the headlines, the whispered retellings, the faces I'd have to meet at the market. I stood slowly cradling Nayara closer. She stirred, but didn't wake her cheek pressed against my coat. Rosa helped me to the door. You need to rest, she said. Tomorrow will come soon enough. Inside the house smelled faintly of rain and soap. I set Nayara on the couch, covered her with a quilt, and watched her sleep. For the first time, her face looked peaceful, not the guarded, wary child I'd known these past weeks, but simply a girl at rest. Outside, Teo and Rosa lingered a moment longer before heading home. Their silhouettes disappeared into the mist, leaving me at the window with the sound of the ticking clock and the faint hum of a world trying to right itself. I stood there until the quiet turned absolute wondering when being right had begun to feel so much like being alone. The letter from Child Protective Services arrived 3 days later, slipped under my door in a plain white envelope. The seal at the top carried no warmth, no apology, just a quiet official authority that made my hands tremble before I even opened it. Inside was a single page. Notice of temporary guardianship approval. Nayara Kittredge. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time reading the words again and again. Each line felt heavier than the last. Pending review of the defendant's charges. Subject to quarterly home inspections. Conditional upon psychological assessment. Across from me, Nayara was coloring quietly. She'd drawn a field of tulips. Each one the wrong color. Blue stems, red leaves, but it didn't matter. Her humming filled the room soft and tuneless. The house had grown used to that sound again. When the knock came, it was gentle, almost apologetic. Leah Benet stood at the door clipboard tucked under her arm. Good morning, Mrs. Kittredge. Mind if I come in for the final inspection? Her presence, though professional, had softened since that night. The edges of protocol dulled by what we'd lived through together. Of course, I said, leading her inside. She moved through the rooms methodically, checking smoke alarms, testing window locks, measuring the distance between stove and counter. We'll also need a safety plan, she said, flipping through her forms. Someone nearby in case of emergencies. Teo Morales, I replied. Across the street. He's agreed to be listed as contact. She smiled faintly. Good. It helps to have someone close. When she finished, we sat in the living room. She placed the final document before me, 4 crisp pages clipped together. At the bottom, a single line waited for my name. This grants you temporary custody until the court hearing, she said gently. After that, a judge will determine if it becomes permanent. I looked down at the paper at the small space where my signature would bind me to every responsibility that love had already demanded. My hand trembled as I took the pen. For a moment, I saw Ethan's handwriting in my mind the way he used to sign checks or birthday cards, the calm loop of his name. I thought of Mireya too, how she'd signed her marriage license with the same flourish, how her letters had grown smaller over the years, as if she were trying to disappear inside them. When the ink touched paper, it felt like closing a circle I'd never meant to draw. Leah gathered the forms, sliding them into her folder. We'll call when the court date is set. You've done everything right, Mrs. Kittredge. I nodded, though the word right didn't fit the shape of my heart. After she left, I stood by the window watching the rain streak down the glass. Across the street, Teo was pruning his hedge again, as if life itself had to be trimmed carefully to keep from growing wild. Nayara wandered in, holding her drawing. Can we put this on the fridge? She asked. "Of course," I said, taking it gently from her hands. She smiled a small, quiet smile and went back to her crayons. The paper rustled softly between my fingers before I pinned it up beside the custody order. 2 pieces of paper, one in color, one in law. Both fragile. Both somehow ours. Spring came late that year, as if the city itself was learning how to start again. By April, the cherry trees along the Willamette were finally blooming, their petals sticking to car hoods and park benches like soft confetti. I began walking Nayara to therapy every Tuesday afternoon, 4 blocks down one across. She liked counting the cracks in the sidewalk, holding my hand for the first few steps, then letting go once she spotted the red door of Dr. Heller's office. Inside, the waiting room smelled faintly of lavender and crayons. There were shelves of children's books and a bin full of dolls, all a little scuffed from use. Nayara would always choose the same 2, a small one with a missing shoe and a taller one with tangled brown hair. She never named them, just called them the girl and the helper. From my chair by the window, I'd watch as she moved them carefully across the dollhouse floor, her lips pursed in concentration. At first, she kept them in the lowest room, the one she called the basement. Over the weeks, they began to climb the stairs. One session, she paused halfway, whispering something to the dolls, then moved them out onto the little painted porch. Dr. Heller glanced at me that day, her expression kind but measured. "Progress," she said softly. At home, I tried to make progress of my own. I started attending a support group for kinship caregivers that met in the basement of a Unitarian church on Belmont Street. The first meeting, I barely spoke. The room was filled with grandparents, aunts, foster parents, each of us carrying someone else's future in our hands. A man with tired eyes talked about his teenage niece and the pills she hoarded. A woman beside me wept quietly as she described explaining court dates to a 5-year-old. When it was my turn, I hesitated. "My daughter's awaiting trial," I said finally. "My granddaughter lives with me now. She's healing, I think." A murmur of understanding moved through the group. Not pity, not shock, just quiet recognition. I kept going back week after week. Some nights I shared stories about Nayara's drawings. Other nights I just listened. There was comfort in that small circle, in the way everyone's grief had different shapes, but the same pulse. At home, the rhythms of our days began to soften. The nightmares that once woke Nayara screaming in the dark grew less frequent. She still asked for the porch light to stay on, but she no longer flinched when I turned off the lamp beside her bed. Sometimes she'd crawl into my lap while I read aloud her hair, smelling faintly of apple shampoo. Other times she'd hum under her breath while helping me fold laundry, a sound that weeks ago had been swallowed by silence. One evening we baked cookies, an old recipe Ethan used to love. Nayara spilled flour across the counter, giggling, her cheeks dusted white. I laughed too, the kind of laugh that starts deep in the chest and surprises you when it comes out. For a second, I saw her father's grin flash across her face, unguarded and bright. After she went to bed, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, the house quiet, except for the ticking of the kitchen clock. Across the street, Teo's porch light glowed steadily. In the distance, I could hear faint music, someone's radio playing a slow waltz from another decade. It drifted through the rain-slicked air, soft and hesitant, like a question that didn't need an answer. Healing, I was learning, wasn't a single act, but a long work, a steady folding of moments into days of fear, into gentleness. And in that quiet, I began to understand that forgiveness doesn't arrive with words or apologies. Sometimes it comes as the silence between 2 heartbeats, when you realize the world has started breathing again. By early summer, the lilacs had bloomed again along the school fence, their scent drifting through the open windows of the gymnasium. Folding chairs lined the floor in careful rows, the kind used for PTA meetings and talent shows. But tonight, the banners on the wall read something different. Community Safety Forum. Noticing signs. Hearing silence. I hadn't wanted to speak at first. Public attention had always made me uncomfortable, and lately it carried a sharper edge. Some of the faces here were the same ones that once crossed the street to avoid mine, the same ones who whispered behind checkout counters. But when Ms. Soraya called a month ago and said, "If you can please come, people will listen to you," I found myself saying yes. Lieutenant Arrieta stood at the podium first. His tone was measured official. When we talk about prevention, he said we're not talking about suspicion. We're talking about noticing patterns, changes in behavior, small fears, inconsistencies that point to something beneath the surface. He described the process in plain words, reporting, verification, the limitations of bureaucracy. He didn't hide the frustration either. We're trained to act only when we have cause, he said. But sometimes cause arrives too late. There was a murmur in the crowd, mothers, teachers, retirees, shop owners. I saw Teo in the back row, arms folded, eyes steady. Rosa sat beside him, her hands clasped around her purse. Then Ms. Soria took the microphone. She spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had spent her life reading children's faces. "We're here because one of our own saw something she shouldn't have had to," she said, "and because a community looked away, believing kindness meant keeping distance. It doesn't." Her voice caught for a moment, then she gestured toward me. "Mrs. Kittredge would like to say a few words." The sound of my name stirred something in the room. Curiosity, guilt, recognition. I stood my knees unsteady and made my way to the front. The microphone squealed briefly before settling into a hum. I looked at the rows of faces. Neighbors, parents, the same city I'd lived in for nearly 50 years, and for a heartbeat, I couldn't find a place to begin. When this started, I said, finally, I thought I was just being careful. My granddaughter said things that didn't fit, and I tried to make sense of them. I wrote them down in a notebook, not because I thought anyone would read it, but because I needed to remember what I'd heard. A ripple of movement passed through the audience, the uneasy shifting of conscience. I called the police once, and they told me to call child services. I called child services, and they said to wait. Everyone was doing their job. Everyone was following the rules, and still there was a child in a basement. The gym was silent, except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. "I'm not here to shame anyone," I continued. "But I've learned that love isn't always quiet. Sometimes love must make noise. Sometimes it has to call and knock and keep knocking until someone answers." A woman in the third row began to cry softly. Arrieta looked down at the floor, hands clasped behind his back. When I finished, there was no applause, just a long silence that felt like something shifting. Then Teo stood and started clapping, slow at first. Then others joined in the sound, spreading unevenly, imperfectly, but real. After the meeting ended, people lingered. Parents came up to ask how Nayara was doing. Others just nodded, the kind of nod that carried quiet apology. Outside, the evening light fell golden through the sycamores. Nayara waited near the car, with her drawing pad, tracing shapes in the fading sun. As we drove home, the windows down the scent of lilacs still followed us. Somewhere behind, the gym lights flickered off one by one, and for the first time in a long while, I felt that the town wasn't just watching anymore. It was listening. By late August, the air had settled into that soft, forgiving warmth that only the end of summer carries. The house smelled faintly of lemon polish and evening tea. On the porch, the brass plaque Teo had helped me mount beside the light caught the glow of the setting sun. Home by invitation only. It wasn't meant to keep people out. It was a reminder for me, for anyone who came after, that love too needed boundaries to survive. Nayara was in the yard chasing fireflies, her laughter floating up through the dusk. She'd grown taller that summer, her hair a little longer, her voice steadier. The fear that once lived in her movements had thinned to something softer, like the trace of a scar that no longer hurt. I set my teacup on the small table beside me, the steam curling lazily upward. The sound of cicadas hummed beneath the distant rumble of the river. When the mail carrier passed earlier that afternoon, he'd left a single postcard tucked under the mat. The front showed a picture of the Salem Rose Gardens, rows of flowers blooming in colors that didn't exist anywhere else. On the back, in careful handwriting, were the words, "We're home now. She's learning to sleep without the light on. You saved the world for us." There was no signature, but I didn't need one. I placed the card beneath my teacup, the corner catching a ring of condensation, and felt something inside me unclench that I hadn't realized was still tight. The legal proceedings had ended quietly a month ago. Mireya's sentence was lighter than some expected, harsher than others. I attended every hearing, but never spoke. There were moments I wanted to reach for her to ask why, to offer something like forgiveness, but words never seemed to fit. Some silences are their own kind of mercy. Nayara never asked about her mother in detail. Children have a way of protecting themselves without realizing it. Once she'd looked up at me while drawing on the porch and asked, "Will Mommy ever come here again?" Maybe I told her, if she learns how to ask. Now, as she ran barefoot through the yard, cupping her hands around light that flickered and escaped, I thought about how survival isn't always loud or grand. Sometimes it's just the quiet persistence of living decently after everything falls apart. Teo's voice drifted from across the street. He was tuning his old radio again, the one that only played music from the 60s. A faint melody of strings and brass floated through the air, mixing with Nayara's laughter and the hum of night insects. I reached for the porch light switch and turned it on. The bulb glowed steady and gold, casting a small circle of safety on the steps. In the reflection of the window, I saw the house behind me, not haunted, not heroic, just alive. I took a slow sip of tea, tracing the rim of the cup with my thumb. The plaque caught the light again, its engraving gentle but unyielding. Beyond the yard, the last of the fireflies blinked out. Nayara waved toward the porch, her voice bright. "Grandma, look, they're dancing." I smiled and lifted my cup in reply. The night deepened, calm and complete, and for the first time in a very long while, the silence felt like courage, quiet, steady, and enough.